Thank you. And this is such a wonderful opportunity to share some magic. And what we've been trying to do in the School of Health and Welfare is understanding the underlying mechanisms of the brain and how they work to support functions in our daily activities, and particularly as children grow and develop the skills they need in order to do the things they have to in daily life. And I would like to say that that music was inspired by a group of children I worked with in a children's prison in South America. And these are children with learning disabilities who designed a dance to the music of Kashmir. And this kicked off my research career in looking at what children are doing and how they're doing it. And mostly, things we do in everyday life require mostly on the most part, 2 hands. Nearly everything we do, even operating a lift, would be better if you could use 2 hands, because otherwise you'll have to put your coffee down to press the lift. So if you can hold something in one hand, you free the other hand. So even if it looks like a one-handed task, you might be better off using 2. So here are some of the wonderful children I've had the chance to work with. So we see the pleasure when they achieve, but the difficulties when you have a weakness or difficulties moving one hand. So we've been designing some therapies to give them an opportunity to develop these skills.
Hello, my name is and I'm going to do up my
Just like to reassure you, all the children went home with 10 fingers. So their achievements when they were able to master these simple tasks, their faces tell us a number of stories. But what makes the difference in the outcomes for these children? And how do the neurological mechanisms underpinning these difficulties influence these outcomes? And can we measure these? And what does this mean for us in developing therapies? So what therapy will work for whom? We have some pictures of different ways of looking at the brain on the upper rows here, from looking at the connections, what I call like the railway tracks of the brain, and how the energy is used. So the two pictures looking at how much oxygen is being consumed to perform simple or more complex tasks. And then the pathways from the brain down to the muscles. And looking at, well, how does that relate to the clinical presentation or the way children are able to behave and perform? What are the parameters that give us this information? And we know that for children with cerebral palsy, and in particular, in this instance, children with a unilateral impairment in which damage to the developing brain has happened in one half of their brain, we know that there's thinning of the pathways and damage to the network control centers. So we can see some lush connections in the two pictures on the left of a typical developing child, the blue representing the connections between the two halves of the brain in the frontal bit of our brain, the yellow mostly where we're connecting our motor areas, or the orangey yellow, and the red, the more sensory and visual centers of our brain linking up. The pictures on the bottom are the connections from the brain down towards our limbs. And we can see that on the right, those with brain damage, even though it's centered to a particular site, it's influencing the connections between the centers of the brain. So how can perhaps a simple ball of elastic bands perhaps help us understand with a bit of magic how the brain connects and is wired up? So to give us a clearer picture perhaps. Now those of you, I'm not sure if you've managed to pick up some magic, great. Because these are really special magic that we have here at Jönköping University, and which we tend to trap, or we like to trap our academics in their rooms and offices to make them work hours at an end. But every once in a while, we're going to want to slip out and get to explore the sites and have some fresh air. So with enough magic, we've escaped to another room. And if you don't believe, you're a little bit more cynical, because sometimes I feel you don't know that there's magic. We're going to trap our magic in, trap those academics until they worked and worked, published at least 5 papers a year for 10 years or more, and they're going to be locked in their offices. No way. We come out and we escape. We come out for light. Did you see that? So we've got them trapped here on these two rooms here, on the first and second fingers. And then they've escaped to the fourth and fifth fingers. Is that for real? So you want to try? So those of you who've got some magic, you place between the first and second fingers. Yeah, and then the magic, this is what we're trying to understand. If you curl all your fingers up, so the fingers, nails, and all are into your ring there, and then they'll jump over. So understanding the simple things, you can even trap it in. Tie it down with your other one. So great opportunity to practice rotating your hand. A simple action you're going to practice all day until you've mastered this. The simple action you need for opening a door. Same thing, you sneak your fingers under there, tuck all your fingernails in, and you've escaped. So you'll practice all day to master that, and not even know you're working really hard to control your two hands and get the timing and the work together. So we wanted to use magic to help us not only help children to practice the simple movements that might help them develop the skills for opening doors, for doing their buttons, for controlling their zips. And the two types of therapies we have that have some evidence are one where you constrain or restrain the hand that's good. So why would you do that? Constrain the hand that can do everything, who's not affected by a stroke or brain damage, to force the use in a scaffolded way of the weaker hand. Or we can train them to work together in intensive bimanual training. So what we did is we added the magic to it, not just to make it fun, but to help us to understand what's going on underneath the mechanisms of work and learning. So these children came to us every day for 2 weeks, and they were with us 6 hours a day practicing and working. But we had them learn magic tricks, which were a fun way of doing that. And so working with costume designers, designing it and making their own costumes, they would perform on stage in 2 weeks' time in a real magic show. So we did simple things that built up into more complex tasks in a fun and safe environment. But what we also did is took the opportunity to take pictures of their brain and take pictures of what's happening underneath. A bit like Katerina this morning was telling us about the surface technologies, we were trying to undergo a bit deeper and find out what was happening within the systems. And then we took pictures of their brains after they finished. And one year we were able to also have a group that agreed to go into the scanner without any intervention for a couple of weeks. And then we had a longer period of intervention for them, and we reviewed them all again. So we were able to track their movement progression and showed that most of the children made fabulous progress in using their two hands to achieve the simple things such as doing up their zips or controlling, holding a button and pushing a button through. So the simple task you just did is opening one hand and closing the other. You need to do to achieve doing up your buttons up. These children achieved that and the results were sustained. So our motor intervention outcomes were fairly good for many of the children. But what I really want to focus on and share with you is some of the work we've been doing to try and understand how that happens so that we can make more targeted interventions. So we can look at the brain in many different ways. The picture on the left is looking at maybe the volume, how thick the layers of the brain are that control different functions. Or as mentioned, we can look at the amount of oxygen that's being used and where it's being used. We can look at the connections between the brain and then marry all that up in more the neuroplastic changes in relation to functional changes. And neuroplasticity relates to the wonderful way our brains are able to do this, even at our age, not always necessarily in the right direction though. So working with children, at least, we were able to get a lot more plasticity sooner because the brains are more actively working for positive and dynamic change. And to measure this, we've used processes such as transcranial stimulation, in which we impose a small stimulus to the brain, electric stimulus, and we track which muscles or where the pathway that is being made. We also look at the activity within the brain. The children like this because they put these wonderful caps on and they get to watch wonderful films, and then we just do some computer games to see which bit of the brain is active doing what sorts of activities. And we can do this magnetic resonance imaging in a child-friendly environment to look at what's happening when they actually move their hands and what pathways are being used. And this is what we found on some of the earlier children. You can see that some of these children have huge lesions. In fact, only half of a brain is really there. And you know the phenomenon of this child? At the age of 7.5, he's in a mainstream school doing really well, just with one hand doing all the work for the most part. And then we have children with more, lesser difficulties or lesser lesion sizes. So the arguments I had with the neurologists on our project, when we put forward to get ethics to do such a program and impose, to come and learn magic for 6 hours a day is not necessarily what every child wants to do, but we did get a huge sign-up for that bit of the project, but to put them through the scanner and some of these other investigations. And our neurologist here, she said, well, don't bother with these older children, because they're too old for their brains to be very plastic and change. So don't include the older children. I thought, well, that's not very fair. And then she said, don't include these with huge lesions, because how can you do a bimanual training when they don't have capacity to make a connection to the other side of the brain? But you know what the phenomenon was, is the child that made the least progress, or progress that we didn't expect, was this child who was the right age group, didn't have a huge lesion, and so why? Why did he not make the progress that we expected? And these others that my neurologist friend said we shouldn't even invite to the summer camp. And that led us to really explore his brain in a lot of detail and to find that those connections, these rich connections between the two halves of the brain that control the movement, weren't very dense. They were very few of these pathways. So few, the two sides of the brain weren't speaking to each other very easily. And therefore we see that his ability to use his weaker hand, the scores were lower than we expected at the end of the camp, but he made a huge amount of progress in using his hand more speedily. So just as a one-handed task, his weaker hand, he was much faster. To complete a task, instead of taking 343 seconds, he went down to 151 seconds. And if I can say that typical children often perform these sequence of 6 tasks in 24 seconds. We still had a long way to go, but he still made a huge amount of progress using his affected hand, but not within a bimanual task. So what we found in these series of experiments was that the white matter integrity, that's the pathways that connect the brain, particularly from the brain down to the hand, did correlate with motor function assessments. So the better connectivity you had, the better pathway connection you had, the better hand function you had. But we found an anomaly in that some children showed pathways from the non-lesioned hemisphere to the affected hand. Because normally what happens, one side of your brain controls the other side of your body. So we're cross-wired. But some of these children retained some connection from their non-lesioned hemisphere. So we thought that could be really good. You know, they've got some pathways connecting from a healthy hemisphere down to their hand. So we were going to explore that in a few more slides. But here we found also that, as we expected, that better connectivity between the two halves of the brain was better for hand function as well. But then what's going to predict the outcome? Because we still have this child who we thought would make good progress because he had better connectivity, he had less damage, he had better pathways from the brain down to the hand, but he didn't have such good connections between the two hemispheres despite quite a small lesion size. So we were looking and exploring this, and we found that actually what was quite fascinating and really encouraging, and against our initial cynical neurologists, that the children with the most damage in the pathways connecting their brain to the hand made the most progress in their hand function. And that children with more leaky connections between the brain and the hand function also made good progress. But yet, that didn't explain the further findings that we had. And so I'll go back to our child here, who really has quite good hand function in two hands. But this task is really quite difficult. What's happening with that bread? Oops. Yeah, it was moving as well. So as he's cutting, the bread is kind of moving around. So he wasn't able to use the one hand to hold still. Both hands were doing the same action. Okay, so in looking at these videos, we started to study, well, how do the two hands talk to each other in time. And we looked at just opening a box and pressing a target inside. And if we watch this, this is the child with a right-handed weakness. He's going to open the box with his left hand first, and then his right hand follows. They're sort of connected in a segmented way, but the one hand follows the other. And then when he leads with his affected hand, so when his right hand starts the task, it kind of has to finish before the next task can do. So it's becoming two separate tasks. Instead of a task to open a box and find something inside, it's becoming open the box, next task is move and touch the target inside. Now we look at another child, and this is a child in Cardiff, and he's going to open the box with his stronger hand, and that's similar to the previous child, but I want you to watch what happens now when he opens the box with his weaker affected hand. What happened to his right hand? Should we see that one again? Okay, so he's leading with his left hand there, that's his affected hand. He totally loses control of his unaffected hand. So we thought this is amazing. Is it just this one child? A phenomenon. But we found a group of it, and this is the work of one of my PhD students, Julian Rudish, who is very clever in trying to understand this phenomenon. So you remember this boy who is trying to open his, do up his zip. And he had some problems with that. And we started looking at his brain. And what we found is similarly very few connections between the two sides of the brain. And when we actually looked at what his hands were doing when we were measuring the brain activity, we found that in a simple task to squeeze both hands together, he couldn't do it as one task. He was working both hands separately. The two sides of the hemisphere were working as completely separate entities. He was able to do one or the other, but when he tried to do both together, he could not coordinate them as a single task. Both sides of the brain are working equally hard, so twice as hard to do the same task that you and I would have done. In contrast, this boy, sorry, I have to keep juggling here. His hand is so tight from muscle spasticity, where the tightness of the muscles stops him really opening and closing it. So we don't really know what's going on in the muscles because we can't see that activity. But when we put the muscle measures onto that, we see that he's actually able, although it's very weak, he is actually able to synchronize the movement of that hand and control that, even though it's a very small movement. You can you can't certainly detect it, with the naked eye, but the action is there. But he also has what's called mirroring, like the boy with the bread. When he's trying to just move one hand, the other hand is also moving. So the muscles are activated, even though he just wants to use the one hand. So we studied this in all the children, and you see almost for every child we have a different profile. So here is their less affected hand on the left here, where they've got the nice synchronous movements. Here you have a little less rhythm to it, but they are. Some of them, child one, hardly able to move the hand, but still. What's fascinating here is several of the children, when they're doing both hands together, their less affected hand is less able. It's less strong. It's less able to generate the same force control that it was when it was just working on its own. But what we see here, subject 8 at the bottom, is the boy with his zipper, how individually the two hands work quite well. He's got a weaker hand, but it's still activating. We can see that. But he can't work them together as a unified action. Whereas subject 9, although he's extraordinarily weak, the little boy with his bottom there, he is able to do them together. And these are important observations, because what we see is we found a subgroup of children in which these mirrored movements or the interactions were interfering with their movements, just opening a box. So imagine how difficult it is. You want to open a drawer and take your cutlery out, or reach a cupboard and take a mug out. Every task becomes, if you try and use two hands, you lose control of your better hand. So what was even more fascinating, and Julian started to explore this in more detail, is what happens to the learning if we impose them to the same box opening task every day they're with us in a summer camp. And what he found is these children who had interference of their their good hands, so it stopped being a good hand in a way. It stopped being able to work towards function. He found that these children tended to have, rather than a gradual progress or an exponential progress in their learning, as we see on the right, these children had a lot of variability, and then they suddenly were able to do it. They suddenly found a way, a strategy that worked to enable them to achieve this task as a single task rather than two separate actions. So their pathway for learning was quite different. Whereas the other children either had a linear progress, so every day they got a bit quicker, they got a bit more overlap, the hands were working in more spatial and temporal coupling. So what does this mean for assessments and treatments? We have, from Martin Stout's work in Germany, we have this understanding that some of these children retain or have this connection from the non-lesioned hemisphere to an affected hand. But we see what is that implication for functional outcomes, and what does this connectivity mean in how the corpus callosum, and that's the bit of the brain that connects the two halves or the two hemispheres of our brain. How does that then develop? And what does that mean for this phenomenon of mirrored movements, where both hands are moving when you don't want them to move? Or perhaps when children stop using their affected hand at all because it interferes with the performance of their less affected or their better hand. So they don't even have one hand that will work for them. And these mixed strategies for motor performance and planning, how does that affect learning and learning rates? And the importance for research or intervention design now is, what is the implication for the type of research? Should we constrain or do this restraint of the less affected hand to force the use when actually we can't control the underlying muscle activity that way? So what type of intervention? Or what timing of it, when in the process of development is going to be most effective? What dose? So how intense? For how long? And so what should that duration be? Because for families to bring kids to a summer camp, while that could be fun, we can't treat that many children all the time, and it's quite interfering to family life. So how can we embed that into participatory interventions on a daily basis? So we're looking at trying to unpick these mysteries of the brain and the way they control movement, considering the contralateral, which is the typical connectivity from one hemisphere to the other side of the body, or the ipsilateral, which is more unusual, or mixed patterns of linking. And should we do then unimanual or bimanual interventions, or something else? Do we need to develop a new intervention? Mixed patterns of connectivity, how does that influence the corpus callosum? That's that middle piece of the brain. And then how does that influence mirrored movements, or the neglect or non-use of that hand? And what is this phenomenon of mirroring? And when it's symmetrical, like we saw with the little boy with his bread, or this asymmetrical, where it's divergent movements, and what intervention is going to be more effective? And what strategies for motor performance are going to help with planning and the impact on the learning profile? So these are the questions we have for designing our interventions and are the next phase of the work here and projects that we're looking at so that we can really target what therapy for whom, integrating our information and combining the clinical and what we're seeing with the imagery parameters. But most importantly, we need to celebrate the success.
It's amazing. My goal would be to see it rolled out in every hospital throughout the country because it won't only help children with hemiplegia, ultimately adults who've had a stroke. We all love having fun. Why shouldn't those people relearn the ability to use their limbs that have been affected by stroke by doing a bit of magic?
So as with all these projects, we have to give thanks especially to the children and their families who've contributed to this work, but also to our partners and funders, and an international collaboration, including those in the Netherlands, in Israel, and in the UK, and here in Jönköping. So the team is broad and captures across disciplines, from physicists to movement scientists, from chemists to imaging specialists, neuropsychologists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, nurses, and many more. So thank you.
Yes, there it goes. Thank you so much for an interesting presentation. I was a little bit curious. You mentioned it briefly when you walked up that you selected Kashmir by Led Zeppelin as your walk-up music. So I would just be interested in hearing a little bit more about this choice.
Yes. My very first research study after qualifying as an occupational therapist in 1990, I was given an award to travel to Chile, and I looked at the role of dance as a form of social integration for children with learning disabilities. And we were allowed to we set up a project in a children's prison. And these children, over the course of a week, choreographed and developed a routine to the music of Kashmir. And it was extraordinary. It was the year after Pinochet had been ousted from power, and they chose to choreograph a dance of an army tank. And it was amazing. It was magical.
A great song for that too. Yeah. So I'm going to pick one of those over here, and I'm also going to ask Elinor Fransson to come up on stage. And on behalf of the school, I would say thank you and congratulations. And I know they have something special for you too, over here.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture about your research. And from the School of Health and Welfare, we want to give you the Professor Apple to celebrate the success of you being our new professor in occupational therapy. We are so happy that you contribute to our education and also in occupational therapy, but also the research in child research environment. So thank you very much, and I will go home and practice the magic and try to impress my family tonight. So thank you very much, and good luck in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just such a pleasure and such an opportunity to be here and to develop this work and continue this.
So good luck in the future.